I'm Salvadoran. My parents were born in El Salvador, and they actually emigrated 40 years ago, close to 40 years ago, from El Salvador to the States during the Civil War in El Salvador. So, some of your listeners might be aware that El Salvador had about a decade long, really violent, really destructive civil war. My parents left the country during that time. They had me here, and I was raised partly in El Salvador, partly in the States. So I traveled between the two places when I was young. And I look, just like a lot of young people born of immigrants or Salvadoran immigrants here, I was really lucky, because of their sacrifices to get some of the opportunities that they never had, right? Like going to college. So I was fortunate enough to go to college here in the States. I studied math and economics. I was always really interested in how the world how we get prices, of things. Like, for example, I was always curious, like the thing that was always curious to me is like when I would drive past a gas station, I would say, who decided that it's 3 cents more today than it was yesterday? That kind of thing was really always like intriguing to me. So anyway, I went to college. I studied math and economics, and then actually my first job right out of college was at an investment bank. I started a career in capital markets. I worked for Morgan Stanley in New York. I was just super, super fortunate to land at what I perceived at the time, to kind of be the center of the universe of the at least of the financial world. 22 years old in 2008, I was that was the dream, I guess. I didn't know any better at the time, but I have to say, I realized I started to learn really quickly what the reality of that lifestyle was, of working at a bulge bracket firm like that. In particular, through the financial crisis of 2008, which it turns out we caused. Right, all this kind of pain and suffering in the United States and abroad was really the responsibility of the banking system, right, which I was a part of. And actually, during that time, I actually also learned, this was in my 20s, right? I started to learn about the history of the financial industry and its impact on El Salvador, right? Like the financial sector, financed one side of the Civil War that pushed my parents out of their country, right? So when I started to learn some of this stuff, it really impacted me, and I after about 5 years in the industry, I decided I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. So I left to pursue things that I thought were more valuable to humanity. So I spent 8 years in nonprofit work and education work here in the States. My wife happens to be an educator, so I followed her into the kind of education and nonprofit realm for about 8 years. Thinking that doing nonprofit work hopefully yields a more fair world, hopefully results in a more fair world than the one that we currently live in. But even that, I think I found some real headwinds and some real frustrations in working in the nonprofit, kind of the fiat-based nonprofit realm. And I guess look, because of my background in capital markets, I was always interested in kind of emergent technologies, right? I was always paying attention, even though I had left the industry, I was always paying attention to emergent technologies. And when I first heard about Bitcoin, I was just curious, right? I'm like, what is this exotic little, thing that you could now hold as part of a portfolio? I wasn't, look, I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer. I don't write any, I can't write a single line of code. So I didn't understand Bitcoin from the kind of the censorship resistance, privacy protecting, if used properly, type of technology. I was looking at it more as a financial asset because that's my background, right? However, as with anyone who spends time, learning about Bitcoin, you suddenly realize just how meaningful, how important, this technology is, in particular for people who have never had a fair shake, at building wealth, or who have been far, far away from the money spigots, right? That those who are really close to those money spigots get to exploit, right? So I learned about Bitcoin. I started learning about Bitcoin as a personal kind of hobby. I really have to say, I didn't have a friend or a family member or an acquaintance who told me about it. I actually kind of I started kind of my formal education through free college courses that were beginning to be offered at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. There was suddenly I think it was 2018, when there was a course called Bitcoin and Blockchain, and it was like 7 hours long. I took that course, and I started going down the rabbit hole, right? Read all the books that we are now, all they're all, canonical texts in the space. Um, and I would say that the real turning point to where I became a person who started to live closer and closer to like a Bitcoin standard, sort of Bitcoin only type of life, came the year of the pandemic in 2020. So when the pandemic hit in March, and we saw, all of these effects in global capital markets. My first reaction through the summer of 2020 was to say, "Wait a minute, I've seen this movie before. I think I know what's going to happen from a government, monetary and fiscal policy response." And sure enough, that's precisely what we saw. So I think at that point I started to realize, wait a minute, I I know what's at stake here. I want to devote the rest of, my life, my career, to supporting the Bitcoin network. So that's when I made my transition into, and I started I began to mine Bitcoin, um, and that further pushed me in the direction of operating effectively exclusively on a Bitcoin standard, because now as a miner, my income became, Bitcoin denominated. I was no longer, or I mean, I'm sorry, I did have a job at the time, and my job paid me in fiat, but my mining operation paid me in Bitcoin, right? And so I started to exercise that muscle at a time where I was still, earning fiat. Uh, um, but I started to taste a little bit, and I could compare the two, I could compare the two modes of living, one which was entirely dependent on my kind of centralized gatekeepers and folks who control who writes my paycheck and that kind of thing, versus the other system, which was purely just a transfer of electricity to money, to sound money, right? And so I really became, I think, I don't, addicted is a strong word, but I became really excited by what this felt like. Suddenly I was like, wait a minute, if I arrange my life properly, I can, if I can make sure that the way that I put food on the table for my family is a direct result of the Bitcoin network, is centralized, global network of people, right? Who are supporting this network. There's no single person in there who can say, no, you don't get a paycheck in 2 weeks, or no, you don't get a raise. I really loved that idea, of freedom from in that realm, right? And so I, over the course of 2020 and 2021, I made the decision to step away from what would be my last job in kind of the fiat world, and devote all of my, attention and energy and resources to helping support the mining industry, in particular as a Salvadoran, as a Latin American, who can hopefully, connect uh, some of the North American mining industry to the region of Latin America, and in particular El Salvador, where my family's from. So today I find myself in this place where, and I think this is kind of what we want to talk about a little bit. Find myself in this place where all of my income, because I no longer have salary somewhere, all of my income, my business income is in Bitcoin, and so I denominate by default in Bitcoin. And all of my expenses now can be paid in Bitcoin. And we can talk a little bit about how that functions.